Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was an overcast afternoon when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered reluctantly, expecting a spam call, but the voice on the other end was solemn and precise. "Is this Daniel Thompson?" the man asked. "Yes, speaking," I replied, my curiosity piqued. "This is Richard Evans, your late great-aunt Miriam's attorney. I'm calling to inform you that you are the sole heir to her estate. She owned a mansion in Willow Creek." The news caught me off guard. Aunt Miriam? I vaguely remembered her from family stories, a recluse who lived alone in a large old house far from the city. I hadn't seen her since I was a child. She was one of those distant relatives you heard about but never really knew. I thanked the lawyer and hung up, feeling a mix of surprise and unease. Inheriting a mansion wasn't exactly the kind of surprise I was hoping for. Living in a small city apartment, the idea of managing a sprawling old house seemed more like a burden than a blessing. However, my profession as a real estate agent kicked in. There was potential here, a chance to flip the property for a significant profit. A week later, I found myself driving towards Willow Creek, the small, forgotten town where the mansion was located. The road was long and winding, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in the further I drove. The town itself was quiet, with a few scattered houses and a general store that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I asked for directions to the mansion, and the old shopkeeper gave me a knowing look. "You're heading to the old Whitmore place?" he asked, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "Yes," I replied, feeling a slight shiver. "It belonged to my great-aunt Miriam." "Ah, Miriam Whitmore. That house has been empty for years," he said. "Be careful up there. It's not the kind of place you want to stay in for too long." I nodded, unsure how to respond, and left the store with an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The drive from the town to the mansion was only about 10 minutes, but it felt like a journey into another world. The road narrowed, flanked by towering trees whose bare branches scratched at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and a sense of isolation settled over me. Finally, I reached the mansion. The first thing I noticed was the gate, tall, wrought iron, and rusted with age. It groaned loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the quiet. The driveway was cracked, with weeds sprouting through the gaps. The mansion itself loomed ahead, a decaying testament to a bygone era. The house was massive, with tall, narrow windows and chipped paint that had once been a vibrant shade of blue, but now faded to a dull gray. The front yard was overgrown, with dead leaves piled against a stone fountain that hadn't worked in years. The house seemed to watch me as I approached, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under my weight. The front door was heavy and made of solid oak, its brass knocker tarnished and dull. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the musty smell of damp air hitting me immediately. The interior was just as time-worn as the exterior. The hallway stretched long and narrow, leading to rooms that branched off on either side. To the right was a spacious living room with high ceilings and a grand fireplace, now cold and unused. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like forgotten lace. To the left was a dining room, its once elegant table now marred by age and neglect. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the patterns faded and stained from years of water leaks. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the uneven hardwood floors. The house felt as if it had been waiting, watching, and now I was here to disturb its slumber. Despite its state, I saw the potential. The house had good bones, as they say, and with the right renovations, it could become a beautiful home again. I imagined the large windows letting in streams of natural light, the grand rooms filled with warmth and life. I could already see the listing in my mind, highlighting the historic charm and original features. I spent the first day cleaning, dusting the old furniture, wiping down tables, and clearing out cobwebs. I found stacks of old books in the living room, some with moldy pages, others surprisingly well preserved. Each book felt like a glimpse into the past, a history I was only beginning to uncover. As the day wore on, I began to feel a strange sense of connection to the house. It was as if it were revealing itself to me, slowly and deliberately. By evening, I was exhausted. I found a small guest room upstairs that seemed the least daunting for a night's rest. It had a simple bed, a nightstand, and a tiny closet. The mattress was old and musty, but I was too tired to care. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboard settling. I felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. Tomorrow, I would start making calls to contractors and begin the process of bringing this house back to life. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than just a structure. It had stories, secrets, and perhaps even a soul. Little did I know, those secrets were waiting to be unearthed, and I was about to become part of the mansion's long and haunting history. The following morning, I awoke to a pale gray light seeping through the cracks of the old window shutters. The air in the room was cool, and for a moment, I lay still, trying to shake off the remnants of uneasy dreams. Something about the night felt distant, like a blurred memory I couldn't quite grasp. I pushed myself out of the bed and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my muscles from the previous day's work. As I moved around the small guest room, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. It wasn't just the physical structure, but something intangible, something heavy in the air. After a quick breakfast of coffee and a stale pastry I'd brought with me, I got to work. The plan was simple: meet with contractors, assess the repairs, and start the renovations. I had already made a few calls, and they were scheduled to arrive by mid-morning. As I wandered through the mansion, preparing for their arrival, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house seemed to groan and sigh, its wooden frame settling into the earth beneath it. Every creak and shift echoed through the halls, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. By the time the contractors arrived, I was eager for the company. A team of 3, John, Mark, and Sarah, stepped out of their truck, carrying their tools and clipboards. They were professionals, seasoned in dealing with old houses like this one, and I felt a flicker of relief at their confident demeanor. We started with a walkthrough, discussing the scope of work. The roof needed patching, the electrical system was outdated, and the plumbing showed signs of neglect. As we moved from room to room, I noticed Sarah pausing now and then, her brow furrowing as she looked around. "Something wrong?" I asked, catching her gaze lingering on the old fireplace in the living room. "No, it's just, this place has a strange vibe," she said, her voice soft. "I've worked on a lot of old houses, but this one feels different." "Different how?" I pressed, curious about her observation. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. It's probably nothing. Just an old house with a lot of history." I nodded, though her words echoed in my mind. History indeed. The house seemed to carry it in its very walls, and as we continued the walkthrough, I couldn't help but wonder what stories were hidden here. The day passed quickly, filled with measurements, estimates, and discussions about materials. By late afternoon, the contractors packed up their tools and promised to send me a detailed quote within a few days. As they drove away, the sense of isolation returned, stronger than before. I spent the rest of the day tackling smaller tasks, clearing out closets, checking for damage, and making a list of items to repair. The house was large, and there was no shortage of things to do. I tried to keep busy, pushing aside the growing unease that seemed to cling to me. By evening, I was exhausted. I heated up a can of soup and ate in the dimly lit kitchen, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I found myself listening intently, waiting for something, anything to break the silence. That night, I decided to sleep in the same guest room. It felt like the safest place in the house, though I couldn't quite explain why. I set my phone alarm for early the next morning, determined to make the most of the daylight hours. As I lay in bed, the weight of the house pressed down on me once more. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the silence grew heavier. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the unease, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sound, a soft, repetitive melody that drifted through the house. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. Piano music. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor playing music late at night. But there were no nearby houses, no other signs of life around. The mansion was isolated, surrounded by woods and silence. I grabbed my phone, the screen casting a dim light as I navigated through the dark hallway. The music seemed to be coming from downstairs, a haunting tune that pulled at me, compelling me to follow. I moved cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the top of the staircase, the music grew clearer. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, each note deliberate and somber. I descended the stairs, the old wood groaning beneath my weight. The sound led me to a part of the house I hadn't fully explored, the basement. The door was closed, and as I approached, I felt a chill in the air. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the doorknob, twisting it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell that led down into darkness. I hesitated, the music still playing softly, beckoning me. Taking a deep breath, I stepped down into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were made of old stone, and the faint smell of dampness hung in the air. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a plain room, filled with old shelves and forgotten boxes. The music stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. My phone's flashlight cast long shadows across the room, and I scanned every corner, looking for the source of the sound. But there was no piano, no stereo, no speakers. Nothing that could have produced the music I had heard so clearly. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt a growing sense of unease. What had I just experienced? Was it a trick of my mind? The house playing games with me? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I hurried back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. My heart raced, and I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, lingered. That night I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the basement and the mysterious music. Sleep was elusive, and when I finally drifted off, it was restless and filled with unsettling dreams. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, both physically and mentally. I tried to brush off the events of the night before, focusing on the tasks at hand. The contractors were scheduled to return, and I needed to be ready. But as I went about my day, the unease never fully left me. The house seemed to breathe around me, its old walls whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. And in the back of my mind, the haunting melody of the piano lingered, a reminder that the house held mysteries far beyond my understanding. I knew then that this was no ordinary house, and my time here was far from over. The mansion had awakened, and it was watching, waiting for me to uncover the truths hidden within its shadowed halls. The morning after the eerie piano incident, I felt the weight of exhaustion pulling me down, but I couldn't let it consume me. There was work to be done, and I was determined to push through. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat at the old kitchen table, staring at the list of repairs. But my mind kept drifting back to the music. The haunting melody was etched into my memory, refusing to fade. I had to know where it came from, what it meant. The house was holding something back, something I needed to uncover. The contractors arrived promptly at 9, and their presence was a welcome distraction. They brought supplies and began their work, the sound of hammers and drills filling the house. I joined them, helping where I could, hoping the physical labor would keep my mind from wandering back to the night before. By midday, the first major task was complete. The roof had been patched, and the old wiring was being replaced. The progress was encouraging, and for a while, I felt a sense of accomplishment. But as the day wore on, the lingering unease returned. During a break, I pulled Sarah aside. She had been the most intuitive about the house's atmosphere, and I felt she might have some insight. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" I began, trying to keep my tone casual. "Sure, what's up?" she replied, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Last night I heard something strange. Piano music coming from the basement. But when I checked, there was nothing there." Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced around as if to ensure no one else was listening. "That's odd. Did you check for any hidden speakers or old instruments?" "I did," I said, shaking my head. "There was nothing, just an empty basement." She frowned, her brow furrowing. "Sometimes old houses hold on to memories. Maybe you're hearing echoes of the past." "Echoes?" I repeated, the word sending a shiver through me. "It's just a theory," she said with a small shrug. "But I've seen it before. Places where strange things happen, and no one can explain why." Her words left me with more questions than answers, but I couldn't dwell on it. The day was slipping away, and there was still work to be done. By evening, the contractors packed up, promising to return the next day. I thanked them and watched as their truck disappeared down the long driveway, leaving me alone once again. I decided to confront the basement mystery head-on. If there was something hidden down there, I needed to find it. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to search every inch of the space. The basement door creaked open, and I descended the narrow stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was cold and damp, the stone walls looming around me. I moved slowly, checking each corner, each shelf, each box. As I searched, my flashlight flickered, and I felt a chill run through me. The music was faint, but unmistakable. Soft, deliberate notes, echoing through the air. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The music led me to a section of the wall that seemed out of place. The stones were uneven, and there was a slight gap between them. I ran my fingers over the surface, feeling for anything unusual. Then I found it. A loose stone, slightly protruding. I pried it loose with the crowbar, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dusty journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. I pulled it out carefully, my hands trembling with anticipation. I carried the journal upstairs, eager to examine it in the light. The leather was embossed with initials, A.W. I opened it, the yellowed pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. The handwriting was elegant, but the ink had faded over time. The entries were dated over a century ago, and as I read, I felt a growing sense of unease. The journal belonged to a woman named Abigail Whitmore, who had once lived in the mansion. Her words painted a picture of a life filled with sorrow and loss. Abigail wrote about the death of her husband, Edward, who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. She described her grief, her isolation, and her growing fear that the house was haunted by his spirit. She believed Edward's soul was trapped, unable to move on, and that the music of the piano was his way of reaching out to her. The final entry was the most chilling. Abigail wrote about a séance she had conducted in the basement, hoping to communicate with Edward. She described how the room had grown cold, how the air had filled with the sound of the piano, and how she had felt his presence. But something had gone wrong. The séance had ended abruptly, and Abigail claimed that a dark force had been unleashed. The journal ended there, leaving me with more questions than answers. What had Abigail experienced? And what had she unleashed in the house? I set the journal aside, my mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but I needed more information. I decided to search the house for any other clues, any other remnants of Abigail's life. I spent the next few hours combing through the mansion, opening drawers, checking behind paintings, and sifting through old papers. I found letters, photographs, and trinkets, each one telling a part of the story. One letter, in particular, caught my attention. It was addressed to Abigail from a man named Dr. Jonathan Hargrove, a local historian and occult expert. He wrote about the seance, warning Abigail of the dangers of meddling with the spirit world. He urged her to seal the basement and leave the house, but it seemed she had ignored his advice. The letter confirmed my suspicions. Abigail had been desperate to reach her husband, and in doing so, she had opened a door she couldn't close. As night fell, I sat in the living room, the journal and letters spread out before me. The house was silent, but I could feel its presence, like a living entity watching and waiting. I knew what I had to do. If Abigail had opened a door, I needed to close it. I needed to finish what she had started and put the spirits to rest. I prepared myself mentally, gathering candles, salt, and the journal. I made my way back to the basement, the air growing colder with each step. I set up the candles in a circle and sprinkled the salt around me, creating a protective barrier. With the journal in hand, I began to read the final entry aloud, invoking the names of Abigail and Edward. The air grew heavy, and the faint sound of the piano began to play, growing louder with each note. I focused on my task, calling out to the spirits, urging them to find peace. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to dance around me. I felt a presence, a weight pressing down on me, but I held firm, repeating the words from the journal. The music swelled, reaching a crescendo, and then, abruptly, it stopped. The air grew still, the coldness lifting. I felt a sense of release, as if a great burden had been lifted from the house. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, the silence now comforting. The house felt different, lighter somehow. The presence that had been watching me was gone, and I knew the spirits had found peace. The next morning, I woke up to a bright, sunny day. The house no longer felt oppressive. It was just an old mansion, filled with history and stories. I spent the day finishing the repairs with the contractors, who noticed the change in atmosphere as well. By evening, the work was done, and the house was ready to be sold. I packed up my belongings, feeling a sense of closure. The mansion had given up its secrets, and now it was time to move on. As I locked the front door for the last time, I glanced back at the house, a faint smile on my lips. The haunting was over, the spirits at rest, and I knew that wherever Abigail and Edward were, they were finally together, free from the confines of the mansion. With a deep breath, I walked away, leaving the past behind. The mansion had been a chapter in my life, a story of mystery and revelation, and now it was time for a new beginning. My name is Sam, and I've always been curious about things most people find too strange or too scary to think about. Ghost stories, unexplained mysteries, and strange places have fascinated me for as long as I can remember. So, when I first heard about the Marwick house on the edge of our little town, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to know more. Everyone in town had their own version of what made the Marwick house so frightening. Some said it was cursed. Others believed it was haunted by people who had disappeared there long ago. A few claimed that at night, you could hear voices coming from the house. Voices of people who weren't alive anymore. Most avoided the place altogether. But not me. It all began on a Saturday afternoon when my best friend Mia brought up the house during lunch. We were sitting on a park bench, sharing sandwiches, when she said, "Sam, you like spooky stuff, right? Ever heard of the Marwick house?" I nodded. "Yeah, but it's just an old story. Nobody's ever proved anything about it." She smirked. "Well, if you think it's nothing, why don't you check it out? I dare you." The way she said it made my heart skip. I had always been confident about my interest in the paranormal, but now I felt like I had something to prove. "Fine," I said after a pause. "I'll go tonight." Mia's eyebrows shot up. "Really? You're actually going in there?" "Why not?" I shrugged, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'll bring my recorder and flashlight. If there's nothing, I'll prove it. If there's something, well, we'll find out." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I packed a small bag. My flashlight, recorder, and notebook were the essentials. I also grabbed a bottle of water and a jacket, just in case the house was colder inside than it looked. By the time I was ready, the sky was dark, and the air had turned chilly. The Marwick house stood on a small hill at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown weeds and crooked trees. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been abandoned for a century. The windows were dark, with broken glass in some places, and the roof sagged as if it might collapse any second. Even from a distance, it gave off an unwelcoming feeling. As I approached, the gravel path crunching under my sneakers felt deafening in the silence. The wind whistled through the trees, and every sound seemed louder than it should be. I paused at the front gate, which hung loosely from its hinges. A wooden sign nailed to the fence had the faded words, "Marwick Estate," carved into it. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the gate. It groaned loudly, and I winced, feeling like I was disturbing something. I walked up the cracked stone path toward the front door. It was tall and heavy, made of old wood that was splintering at the edges. When I pushed it open, it creaked loudly, the sound echoing into the darkness beyond. The inside of the house smelled old, like damp wood, dust, and something faintly sour. The air felt heavy, almost like it was pressing down on me. I shone my flashlight around and saw peeling wallpaper, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and broken furniture scattered across the floor. "Just an old house," I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the uneasiness creeping up my spine. I stepped inside, the wooden floor groaning under my weight. Every sound I made seemed to bounce off the walls and echo back at me, making me feel like I wasn't alone. I walked into what seemed to be the living room. A cracked mirror hung on the wall, and an old, torn sofa sat in the corner. The fireplace was filled with ashes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I set my recorder on the mantel and hit the record button. "It's January 15th, I said, my voice shaky but clear. "I'm in the Marwick house, trying to find out if the stories are true. The house is old, falling apart, and completely silent. For now." I listened for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I moved on, exploring the rest of the house. The hallway was narrow, with faded family portraits hanging on the walls. Most of the faces in the pictures were blurred, the glass smudged and cracked. It felt strange, like the house was trying to hide the people who had once lived there. I turned into another room, a dining room, I guessed. The long wooden table was covered in dust, with chairs pushed back as if someone had left in a hurry. The chandelier above it was missing half its crystals, and the floor was littered with broken pieces. As I moved deeper into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Finally, I found what I thought would be the perfect spot to sit and wait, an empty room with tall windows that looked out onto the overgrown garden. The room had a single chair in the center, and the floor was surprisingly clean compared to the rest of the house. I placed my recorder on the chair, pulled out my notebook, and wrote down my observations. For a long time, nothing happened. I listened to the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. My flashlight cast long, moving shadows on the walls as I adjusted its beam. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old, empty house. But then, something changed. It started as a faint hum, so soft I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. I leaned closer to the recorder, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It grew louder, slowly, until it became a soft melody. It was a song, an old-fashioned tune, like something from a music box. My heart started to race. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. The humming stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move across the far wall. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to sound brave. The air felt colder now, and the smell of dust was replaced by something sweeter, like flowers or perfume. My hands shook as I grabbed the recorder and whispered into it, I think someone's here." I stood up and scanned the room with my flashlight. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, I heard it. A soft laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make my blood run cold. It sounded like a woman, but there was something strange about it. Something off. I didn't know whether to stay or run, but my curiosity got the better of me. I turned off the recorder and decided to follow the sound. As I walked down the hallway, the laughter grew fainter, almost like it was moving away from me. I passed by doors that were slightly open, peeking into rooms that seemed untouched for years. But every time I thought I was getting closer to the source of the sound, it faded again. Finally, I reached the staircase leading to the upper floor. The steps looked worn and fragile, but the laughter seemed to be coming from somewhere up there. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're not scared," I told myself. "It's just a house." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. I stood at the base of the staircase, staring up into the darkness. The faint laughter that had lured me this far was now gone, leaving only silence and the weight of uncertainty. My flashlight wavered slightly in my trembling hand as I debated what to do. The stairs looked ancient, with warped wood that creaked even before I set foot on them. Dust floated in the beam of my light, swirling lazily in the still air. A part of me wanted to turn around, to leave the Marwick house and its eerie whispers behind. But another part, the curious part that had brought me here in the first place, refused to back down. "I'm just imagining things," I whispered to myself. "There's nothing here but an old house falling apart." I repeated the thought like a mantra as I placed my foot on the first step. It groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the hallway behind me. Slowly I climbed, gripping the wobbly banister with one hand while keeping my flashlight trained on the top of the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to stop me. By the time I reached the landing, my breathing was shallow, and my palms were slick with sweat. The upper floor was even darker than the one below. The air felt thicker, colder, and my flashlight struggled to cut through the oppressive gloom. I swept the beam across the hallway, revealing closed doors on either side, their paint peeling in long, jagged strips. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. It sounded small and fragile, like it didn't belong here. No answer. I took a few cautious steps forward, the floorboards beneath me creaking loudly. The sound reminded me of the laughter I'd heard earlier, sharp and unsettling. I tried to push the thought away, focusing instead on the doors. The first door I came to was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. I nudged it open with the tip of my flashlight, wincing as the hinges let out a long, drawn-out squeal. The room inside was small and empty, except for a single rocking chair positioned by the window. Its cushions were faded and torn, and a thick layer of dust coated its wooden frame. The chair faced outward, as if someone had once sat there watching the world beyond the Marwick house. I stepped inside, the floor groaning beneath me. My flashlight picked out a few details. The wallpaper, which was covered in strange, faded patterns. The ceiling, where water stains spread like dark veins. And the floor, littered with scraps of paper. Curious, I bent down to pick up one of the scraps. It was brittle and yellowed, the writing on it faint and smudged. I could barely make out the words, but they sent a chill through me. She is always watching. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, and I jumped, dropping the paper. The rocking chair creaked softly, though I was certain I hadn't touched it. I backed out of the room quickly, my flashlight shaking as I pulled the door shut behind me. My heart was racing now, and every instinct told me to leave. But I couldn't. Something about the house, about the strange laughter and the note, kept pulling me deeper. I moved down the hallway, stopping at the next door. This one was closed tightly, and when I tried the handle, it stuck. I pushed harder, and the door finally gave way with a loud crack, swinging inward to reveal a bedroom. The room was larger than the last, with a canopy bed that looked like it belonged in a museum. The curtains around it were tattered and gray, swaying slightly in the still air. A dresser stood against one wall, its mirror cracked and foggy with age. As I stepped inside, I felt the temperature drop sharply. My breath came out in small clouds, and my flashlight flickered once, then again. "Is someone here?" I asked, my voice trembling. For a moment there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it, a whisper. It was soft and unintelligible, but it was there. I swung the flashlight around, trying to find the source. The beam landed on the dresser and I froze. In the cracked mirror, I saw something move. It wasn't me. The figure was faint, almost translucent, but it was there. A woman, dressed in a long, flowing gown that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her face was turned away, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. I blinked, and she was gone. My chest tightened, and I took a step back, bumping into the edge of the bed. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with a low, droning hum. "Who are you?" I managed to say, though my voice barely rose above the noise. The whispering stopped, and then, clear as day, a voice answered, "Leave." It was a single word, but it was enough to send me scrambling for the door. I ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My flashlight flickered again, and I smacked it against my palm, desperate to keep it working. The hallway stretched out before me, darker and longer than I remembered. My footsteps echoed loudly as I hurried toward the staircase, but something felt wrong. The air was heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I felt like I was being watched, like 1,000 invisible eyes were following my every move. When I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The staircase was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the same cracked and peeling wallpaper that lined the rest of the house. I stared at it, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I had just come up these stairs. "Let me out," I whispered, my voice shaking. The house didn't respond. I turned back, my flashlight darting across the hallway. The doors I had passed earlier were all closed now, and the air felt colder than ever. I took a shaky step forward, unsure of where to go. And then I heard it. The laughter was back, louder this time. It echoed down the hallway, high and mocking. It sounded like it was coming from every direction at once, surrounding me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The laughter stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic sound. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. Then, a door creaked open. It was the door to the room with the rocking chair. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, I thought it would die completely. I stepped toward the open door, my legs feeling like lead. Inside, the rocking chair was moving, rocking slowly back and forth. And sitting in it was the woman from the mirror. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and sunken. She looked at me, her gaze piercing and unblinking. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with anger. I was curious," I stammered, unable to look away. Her lips twisted into a cold smile. "Curiosity can be dangerous." The rocking chair creaked louder, and the room seemed to darken around her. The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, making it hard to breathe. "Leave," she said again, her voice echoing. "Leave while you still can." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, not caring about the closed doors or the missing staircase. My only thought was to get out, to escape the house and its ghostly occupant. When I reached the spot where the staircase had been, it was back, as if it had never disappeared. I didn't question it. I raced down the steps, nearly tripping in my haste. The front door was open, the cool night air spilling in. I sprinted toward it, bursting out into the overgrown yard. I didn't stop running until I was far from the house, the lights of town visible in the distance. Only then did I look back. The Marwick house stood silently on its hill, dark and looming. And in the upper window, I saw her watching me. I stumbled back toward the safety of town, my legs aching and my lungs burning. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless reminder of what I'd seen in the Marwick house. The ghostly woman's warning echoed in my mind, her voice still clear despite the distance I'd put between myself and the house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wasn't enough. That house, the spirit within it, wouldn't let me go so easily. As I reached the outskirts of town, I stopped and doubled over, trying to catch my breath. The faint outline of the Marwick house loomed in the distance, its silhouette framed by the moonlight. It looked deceptively still, but I knew better. There was something alive in that place, something ancient and angry. I needed answers. The local library seemed like the only place to start. It was late, but the librarian, Mrs. Carraway, often stayed late to organize books. Her passion for preserving the town's history meant she might know something about the Marwick house. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors, startling Mrs. Carraway, who was perched on a stool by the archives. "Sam," she said, adjusting her glasses. "What are you doing here at this hour? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I might have," I replied, my voice trembling. "I need to know about the Marwick house." Her expression darkened. "The Marwick house? Why on earth would you go there?" I hesitated. "I heard stories. I wanted to see it for myself." Mrs. Carraway sighed, climbing down from the stool. "That house has a long and troubled history. Most people around here know better than to go near it." "What happened there?" I asked. She motioned for me to follow her to a table where she laid out a large, leather-bound book. Its pages were filled with faded newspaper clippings and handwritten accounts. "The house was built in the late 1800s by Charles Marwick," she began, flipping through the pages. "He was a wealthy merchant who moved here with his wife, Eliza. They were the picture of happiness, until tragedy struck." Mrs. Carraway pointed to a yellowed clipping with the headline, "Mysterious Death at Marwick Estate." "Eliza fell ill one winter," she continued, her voice low. "The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Within weeks, she was gone. Charles was devastated. He became obsessed with the idea that her death wasn't natural, that something had taken her from him." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He claimed to hear her voice in the house, calling to him," she said. "He spent years trying to contact her, delving into unorthodox methods. Some say he succeeded." "What happened to him?" "No one knows for sure. He vanished one night, leaving the house empty, but people say his obsession left a mark on the place, and that Eliza's spirit never found peace." The memory of the ghostly woman in the rocking chair sent a shiver down my spine. "What about now? Why does she seem so angry?" Mrs. Carraway hesitated before answering. "Spirits tied to a place can grow restless over time, especially if they feel forgotten or wronged. You may have disturbed her by going there." "What can I do?" I asked. She closed the book and looked at me gravely. "You need to make amends. find a way to give her peace, or leave the house alone forever. I swallowed hard, knowing what I had to do. The idea of going back to the Marwick house filled me with dread, but I couldn't ignore the sense of unfinished business. Armed with what little knowledge I had, I prepared to return. I packed a few essentials, a candle, matches, and a journal to document anything I found. The town was silent as I made my way back to the hill where the house stood. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that seeped into my bones. The front door was still ajar, just as I'd left it. I stepped inside, my flashlight illuminating the dust-filled air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps. "I'm here to help," I called out, my voice trembling. "I just want to understand." No response. I climbed the staircase again, each step groaning beneath me. The hallway stretched out before me, the closed doors like sentinels guarding their secrets. I returned to the room with the rocking chair, where I had last seen the ghostly woman. The door creaked open, revealing the chair, now still. "Eliza?" I said softly, stepping inside. The temperature dropped immediately, and the rocking chair began to move. The woman appeared again, her translucent form shimmering in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice cold and distant. "I came to help," I replied, holding up my hands. "I know what happened to you, and I want to help you find peace." Her eyes narrowed. "Peace? There is no peace in this place." "There can be," I insisted, "but I need to know what's keeping you here. Why are you still tied to this house?" She hesitated, her expression softening for a moment. "He wouldn't let me go," she whispered. "Charles. He tried to keep me here, even after death." I nodded slowly. "I read about his attempts to contact you. But he's gone now, Eliza. You don't have to stay." Her gaze darkened. "He may be gone, but his presence lingers. His obsession, it poisoned this house." The room seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. I could feel the weight of her sorrow and anger pressing down on me. "What can I do?" I asked. She looked at me, her expression a mix of hope and fear. "There is a box," she said, "hidden beneath the floorboards in his study. It holds the remnants of his experiments. Destroy it, and perhaps I can be free." I nodded, determined to help. "Where is the study?" She pointed toward the end of the hallway. "The last door." The study was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. Books and papers were scattered across the floor, their edges curled with age. I searched the room carefully, using my flashlight to examine every corner. Finally, I found a loose floorboard near the desk. I pried it up with my hands, revealing a small wooden box beneath. The box was heavy, its surface carved with strange symbols that made my skin crawl. I opened it cautiously, revealing its contents: a collection of vials, tattered notes, and a lock of dark hair tied with a ribbon. Eliza's voice echoed in the room. "Burn it. All of it." I took out the candle and matches, lighting the wick with shaking hands. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls as I set the box and its contents on the floor. As the fire consumed the items, the room seemed to come alive. The walls shook, and a low, guttural sound filled the air. The symbols on the box glowed briefly before fading into ash. "Eliza?" I called out, looking around. She appeared before me, her form brighter and more solid than before. She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression that transformed her face. "Thank you," she said softly. "I can feel the weight lifting." The house trembled violently, and I stumbled, struggling to stay on my feet. "What's happening?" I shouted. "The house is letting go," she said. "It's finally free." Her form began to fade, her features softening as she dissolved into light. "Thank you," she whispered one last time before disappearing completely. The trembling stopped, and the house fell silent. I left the Marwick house as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive weight I'd felt before was gone. When I turned back to look at the house one last time, it seemed different, less menacing, almost peaceful. I had a cousin named Lila. She was 1 year older than me, with curly brown hair that looked like springs and eyes as green as a summer leaf. Lila was the bravest person I knew, always exploring places we weren't supposed to go. She once climbed to the top of the big oak tree in her backyard and waved down at me like she'd conquered the world. But one summer, when I stayed over at her house, something strange happened. Lila and I discovered an old wooden box in the attic. It was tucked away under a pile of dusty blankets, hidden so well we almost missed it. The box was carved with swirling patterns, and the latch was surprisingly cold to the touch, even though the attic was boiling hot. Inside were 6 dolls. They were unlike any dolls I'd ever seen. Each one looked like it had been carefully crafted by someone who loved their work too much. Their faces were delicate and smooth, and their eyes seemed too real, as if they were watching us. Lila picked up a doll with a green dress and black curls, declaring it her favorite. "This one's mine," she said, holding it up like a trophy. I chose a doll with fiery red hair and a dress the color of the sky before a storm. It looked bold, like it had secrets to tell. We didn't think much about the others at first, but something about them made me feel uneasy. That night, after dinner, Lila and I sat in her room, playing with our dolls. We named them. Hers was Morel, and mine was Rowan. The others stayed in the box, their eyes gleaming under the lamplight. Lila joked about how they might come alive at night. "They're too creepy to just sit there," she said with a grin. We laughed, but deep down, her words stuck with me. When we went to bed, I kept Rowan close, thinking that if the dolls did move, mine would protect me. Around midnight, I woke up. The room felt different. Lila was asleep in her bed, her arm draped over Morel. But the other dolls, the ones we left in the box, weren't there anymore. I sat up, my heart racing. Where were they? I glanced around the room, and that's when I saw it. One of the dolls, the one with pale yellow hair and a lavender dress, was standing upright on the windowsill. Its tiny head tilted toward me, like it was curious. "Lila," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. She groaned and rolled over, annoyed. "What?" she mumbled. "The dolls," I said. "They're moving." Lila sat up, rubbing her eyes. She saw the doll on the windowsill and froze. "How did it get there?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. We crept over to the window, but before we could grab the doll, it fell. Not to the floor, but into the shadows below. I thought I saw it crawling away, but it was too quick to be sure. Lila and I stared at each other, unsure what to do. "Let's check the attic," she said, grabbing a flashlight. The attic was even darker and quieter than before. Our footsteps creaked on the old wooden floor as we climbed the stairs. The box was still there, but it was empty. "I don't like this," I said, gripping Rowan tightly. Lila ignored me and pointed her flashlight around the room. The beam caught a glimpse of something moving in the corner. It was another doll, the one with short black hair and a gold dress. It darted behind a stack of boxes, faster than any doll should have been able to move. "That's not normal," Lila whispered, her bravery fading. We decided to take the box and the dolls we still had downstairs. We thought maybe if we locked them up again, everything would go back to normal. But the dolls had other plans. As we carried the box to Lila's room, we heard tiny footsteps behind us. We turned, but nothing was there. Then, suddenly, Morel slipped out of Lila's hands and landed on the floor. She stood up by herself, her tiny painted lips curling into a smile. "They don't want to go back," Lila said, her voice shaking. I didn't know what to say. The dolls began to surround us, their little eyes glowing in the dark hallway. They whispered words we couldn't understand, but their voices were cold and sharp, like the wind on a winter night. Rowan, the doll in my hands, suddenly moved, not to attack, but to protect. It turned toward the others and seemed to challenge them. The glowing eyes dimmed for a moment, and the whispers grew quieter. "Rowan's helping us!" I shouted. Lila grabbed Morel, who also started to move, joining Rowan. Together, the two dolls stood against the others, driving them back into the shadows. By morning, the other dolls were gone, and the box was sealed shut. We didn't know where they went, but we decided to bury the box deep in the woods behind Lila's house. "We'll never speak of this again," Lila said, and we didn't. But sometimes, late at night, I think. So if you ever find an old box in the attic, promise me you'll leave it alone, because some toys aren't meant to be played with. My name is Iris, and this is the story of the strangest dinner party I've ever hosted. I live in a small house with my dad, Frank, who works as a carpenter. He's a kind man, but usually too busy fixing things around town to help with house stuff. My mom, Elena, passed away a few years ago, so it's just the two of us most of the time. I'm 10, by the way, and I like drawing comics and watching old movies. This all happened last year when we decided to throw a dinner party for my Aunt Lucinda. She's my mom's sister and had just finished her treatments for something called chemo. Dad said it was important to celebrate because she was feeling better. Aunt Lucinda loves plants and flowers, so I made paper decorations that looked like tulips and daisies to hang up around the house. Since we were expecting a lot of family and friends, like my cousins, Uncle Pete, and even our neighbors, the Bensons, Dad hired a chef to cook for us. His name was Victor, and Dad said he found him online. Victor was supposed to arrive early, cook in our kitchen, and then leave before the party started. Everything sounded fine at first, but when Victor showed up, things got weird. Victor looked different from anyone I'd ever met. He was tall and skinny, with long black hair tied back in a ponytail. His face was pale, and his eyes were so dark they almost looked black. He wore a wrinkled white chef's coat and carried a big bag of cooking tools. When I opened the door to let him in, a strange smell wafted in with him. It wasn't like rotten eggs or stinky cheese. It was something I couldn't place, like wet leaves mixed with old socks. He gave me a crooked smile and said, "You must be Iris. I'm here to make the party unforgettable." Something about the way he said unforgettable sent a shiver down my back, but I nodded and led him to the kitchen. Dad came in to say hello and left quickly, mumbling about picking up some surprise guests from the airport. Victor started unpacking his things, shiny knives, strange spices in little jars, and a big black pot that looked ancient. "This pot has been in my family for generations," he said, patting it like it was a pet. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled awkwardly and went back to hanging up my paper flowers. The first hour was fine. I heard the clatter of pots and pans and the sizzle of food cooking. But then Victor started calling me into the kitchen every few minutes. "Iris, come taste this," he'd say, holding out a spoon. The food tasted okay, but each dish had a strange aftertaste, like metal or smoke. "Are you using some kind of special ingredient?" I asked. Victor's lips curled into a sly grin. "You could say that. Every dish needs a bit of magic." I didn't like the way he said magic, but I didn't want to be rude, so I shrugged and went back to my decorations. As the day went on, Victor started acting stranger. He hummed a tune I didn't recognize, low and haunting, while chopping vegetables. He muttered to himself in a language I didn't understand, and once I caught him staring out the window, whispering something under his breath. When I asked what he was doing, he snapped out of it and said, "Just getting inspired." By 5 o'clock, Victor was still in the kitchen. The house smelled like a mix of garlic, herbs, and something off. I reminded him that the guests were coming soon and he needed to be done. He nodded but didn't speed up. When I checked again at 5:45, he wasn't in the kitchen. I looked outside and saw him on the back porch wearing regular clothes and chatting with my cousin Julian like they were old friends. I marched up to him. "Victor, you need to finish cooking and leave. The party's starting soon." He gave me another crooked smile. "Don't worry, little Iris. Everything's under control." But it wasn't. When I went back into the kitchen, the food was bubbling and boiling in pots, but no one was stirring them. I turned off the stove and started setting the dishes aside. That's when I noticed something strange. The food looked normal at first, but when I looked closer, I saw tiny, wriggling shapes in the sauce. Were those bugs? Worms? My stomach turned. "Victor!" I yelled. He appeared in the doorway, calm as ever. "Is something wrong?" I pointed to the pot. "What is this? Why is there stuff in the food?" He stepped closer and peered into the pot. "Ah, just a little protein. You know, some cultures find it quite delicious." I backed away. "You can't serve this to my family. They'll get sick." Victor's smile faded, and his eyes darkened. "Iris, you don't understand. This food isn't just for eating. It's for something bigger." We threw the pot away and ordered pizza for the party. Aunt Lucinda loved my decorations, and everyone had a good time, but I couldn't stop thinking about Victor and his creepy food. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that low, haunting tune he hummed, and I wonder if I'll ever see him again. My name is Cade, and I want to tell you about the scariest thing that ever happened to me. It all started when my family decided to host a dinner party. You see, we had just moved to a small town called Everstead, where everyone seemed to know everyone else. My mom, Lena, is a teacher, and my dad, Grant, works as a mechanic. I'm 12, and my sister Nora is 10. We're a pretty normal family, but this story is anything but normal. The dinner party was supposed to be a celebration for our neighbor, Mrs. Trudy. She's an older lady who had just recovered from a long illness, and my parents thought it would be nice to invite some of the neighbors over to make her feel special. Since we didn't know many people in town yet, my mom decided to hire someone to help with the cooking. That's how we met Jasper. Jasper showed up at our house on the afternoon of the party. He had been recommended by someone my mom worked with, but she had never met him in person before. When he arrived, I remember thinking he looked different. He was tall and thin, with a scruffy beard and hair that stuck out in every direction. He wore a faded green jacket and carried a big, old-fashioned suitcase. His voice was deep, and when he spoke, it felt like he was choosing every word very carefully. "Good afternoon," he said, giving us a crooked smile. "I'm Jasper. I'll make sure your party is one to remember." Something about the way he said "one to remember" made me feel uneasy, but I didn't say anything. My mom welcomed him inside and showed him to the kitchen. Jasper opened his suitcase and started pulling out his tools, shiny knives, jars of spices, and a strange black pot that looked like it belonged in a museum. "This pot has been in my family for generations," he said, running his hand over it. "It's the key to all my best recipes." My sister and I exchanged a look. "That's a weird pot," Nora whispered to me. I nodded but didn't say anything. At first, everything seemed fine. Jasper got to work chopping vegetables and stirring sauces. The house started to smell like garlic and spices, but there was another smell too. Something faint but strange, like burnt wood. I figured it was just part of his cooking. About an hour later, things started to get odd. Jasper kept calling me and Nora into the kitchen to taste his food. "Tell me what you think," he said, holding out a spoon. The food tasted okay, but there was always a strange aftertaste, like something metallic. When I asked him about it, he just smiled and said, "It's a secret ingredient." While Jasper was cooking, I noticed he kept glancing at the black pot. Sometimes he would whisper to it like he was talking to someone. Once I saw him drop something into the pot and quickly cover it with the lid. I tried to see what it was, but he turned around and blocked my view. "What are you doing?" I asked. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just adding a little magic," he said. By late afternoon, the kitchen was filled with dishes. Jasper had made soups, salads, and even a huge roast. My mom came in to check on things and told him he needed to finish up soon because the guests would be arriving in an hour. Jasper nodded, but he didn't speed up. When the first guests arrived, Jasper was still in the kitchen. My parents were busy greeting everyone, so I went to find him. But he wasn't in the kitchen. I looked outside and saw him on the back porch, talking to one of the guests. He wasn't wearing his jacket anymore, and he had changed into a plain shirt and jeans. It was like he thought he was part of the party. "Jasper, you're supposed to be in the kitchen," I said. He turned to me and smiled. "Don't worry, Cade. Everything's under control." But it wasn't. When I went back into the kitchen, I saw that the black pot was still on the stove, bubbling away. I lifted the lid and immediately wished I hadn't. Inside the pot, there were things moving. Not just bubbles, but actual shapes, like tiny squirming worms. I dropped the lid and backed away, my heart racing. "What's wrong?" Nora asked, coming into the kitchen. "Something's not right," I whispered. "We need to tell Mom and Dad." Before we could leave the kitchen, Jasper walked in. He saw the pot and frowned. "You shouldn't have opened that," he said, his voice low and serious. "What's in there?" I asked, my voice shaking. He stepped closer and looked me in the eye. "It's better if you don't know." I grabbed Nora's hand and pulled her out of the kitchen. We found our parents and told them everything. My dad went to confront Jasper, but when we got back to the kitchen, he was gone. The black pot was still there, but it was empty. The stove was off, and all the food he had made was gone too. We never saw Jasper again, but sometimes, when it's quiet at night, I think about that pot and the strange things I saw inside it. I wonder what Jasper was really cooking and why he left so suddenly. My parents say it was probably just a misunderstanding, but I'm not so sure. I think there was something much darker going on, something we were lucky to escape.